Yet doctrine is brittle when reality arrives in the form of timing, wind, a single bomb. Midway would be decided as much by a handful of seconds as by months of planning. If you value deep historical accounts like this, hit like and check the sources linked below. By dawn on June 4, the Pacific air was a lattice of planes, decks, and waiting crews. Nagumo's carriers were laden in different states of readiness. Some decks were full of aircraft ready for a second strike against shore facilities. Elsewhere, planes were being rearmed and refueled in anticipation of finding enemy carriers. A handful of ordnance crews worked with practiced speed, moving bombs and fuel like chess pieces. Each placement held the possibility of success or ruin. The vulnerability of a carrier when its decks are crowded and its hangars exposed is a simple, terrible fact. Ordnance on deck means fuel, and fuel means fire will consume the ship faster than any effort at control. That calculus was as true on June 4 as it had ever been. What followed would demonstrate how quickly a carefully ordered mechanic could turn into an engine of catastrophe. From the American perspective, timing and angle mattered in a way that would be remembered in shorthand by pilots and survivors. The phrase, "out of the sun," would later be used to explain the suddenness of the attack. Dive bombers descending from a bright sky where the sun blinded gunners and decks alike, threading their way through cloud and smoke to strike at the precise moments when vulnerability peaked. Those pilots did not seek glory, they sought angles. They found them. A single correctly placed bomb through a hangar roof could detach a carrier from the realm of the maritime and make it an altar of flame. Akagi and Kaga, the great carriers that had been at the center of Japan's carrier aviation doctrine, felt that transition in quick succession. The deck that had launched so many planes became a place of exploding fuel, collapsing structures, and searing heat. The timeline compressed. Men who years earlier had coordinated premeditated operations now moved with a speed that felt improvised. Messages came in clipped signals, then pinched into whisper-like reports passed by hand. The motif of time, 5 minutes, began to insist itself. 5 minutes to launch, 5 minutes to rearm, 5 minutes in which a bomb could find its mark and change the fate of a ship. 5 minutes that stacked up into the uncanny calculus of catastrophe. Officers would later speak of how long it took from the first hit to the moment that command authority faltered. The answer repeated itself in testimony. 5 minutes, sometimes less. On Nagumo's bridge, the air turned colder with the realization of the pattern.
A decision that had been tactical and routine, to recall strike planes, to ready torpedoes, to shift from shore bombardment to a hoped-for encounter with enemy carriers, became a question of timing, of whether the decks would be cleared before the sun delivered its guests. Nagumo had faced choices: to keep decks filled for a second strike against Midway's facilities, or to switch to a posture of readiness for the carriers he had been sent to find. The orders were not only about hardware, they were about how to construe the day's unknowns. When the dive bombers appeared, the Japanese air defenses were not prepared in every place at every instant. Ships that had been configured for one phase of the operation found themselves locked into another. The first correctly placed hits changed everything. Fires leaped through hangars, and the weight of ordnance on crowded decks turned the carriers into tinderboxes. Power failed, communications splintered, smoke filled the island of the sea. Fuchida Mitsuo stood among the confusion with the odd simultaneity of memory and injury. He had led the strike at Pearl Harbor, and the symmetry of his presence at a carrier's fall did not escape him. Wounded and carried from one reality to another, he replayed the striking reversal. The ship that had been a symbol of triumph was now a pyre. He thought of the faces of his pilots, of preparing for one battle and encountering the mirror image of their victory. He would later recall, in writing and speech, the audacity of seeing a carrier go from center of power to beauty consumed, a lesson that a rival of fire can teach better than doctrine. In the harried channels below decks, some officers froze. Staff Commander Kuroshima Kamito, posted at his station, found that his training did not furnish him with the language for what he saw. He remained at his post, motionless, a human hinge between procedure and collapse. His immobility was not shameful, it was a stark human testimony to the suddenness of the turn. Others ran with purpose that blurred into panic. crews attempted to move guns, to hose flames, to cut loose burning fuel-soaked planes. Men shouted orders that could not be heard above the din of explosions. There was an intimate cruelty to the way damage propagated. One explosion would break a fuel line. That line would feed another blast. That blast would sever power and communications, and the ship's nerve centers would begin to short-circuit. We think of ships as steel and rivets, but at a moment like Midway, they became a collection of small human labors undone in sequence. A single misaligned bomb could be the rod that unlatched catastrophe, and often it was exactly that. Ships that were built for endurance at sea, for long campaigns of attrition and maneuver, were not designed to withstand a firestorm that started within their decks. The crews fought as best they could. Some saved the day, some did what they could only to be consumed.
The accounts of those who survived the fires are punctuated by small acts. An officer passing a hand mirror to a burned sailor so he could see his own reflection. A petty officer dragging a wounded man toward a ladder while flames licked behind them. A pilot who refused to abandon a comrade and found both of them delayed into death. None of these acts rewrite the strategic calculus, but they render the human texture of a failing plan. News moved along routes that were sometimes official and sometimes improvisational. On the Yamato, the folded message arrived as a compressed fact. On command decks, it arrived as a string of dots and dashes that had to be parsed, translated into meaning, and then folded back into action. The distinction between signal and sentence collapses when decisions are urgent. A line of symbols became a verdict that demanded response. Vice Admiral Nagumo's staff moved in that metal-scented atmosphere of command. Men around him recorded orders, tried to make sense of incoming reports, and watched as the carriers under his responsibility turned into isolated bastions of fire. There were attempts to restore order, to reorganize air cover, to rip planes loose from fuel-streaked decks. The very training that had created a smooth machine now found itself trying to improvise in a new problem set. Timing, again, was the cruel determinant. The minutes between hit and conflagration were measured in breaths. An officer somewhere in the fleet would later write of the sensation that washed over commanders when the first proper hits were scored. A sudden and precise contraction of hope, as if a muscle voluntarily went into spasm. It was not panic as much as the recognition of arithmetic, that the loss of one carrier was a blow. The loss of 2 or 3 signaled a series of compounding logistic deficits that the Navy could not easily repair. Men calculated in their heads what replacements would be needed, how many pilots, how many planes, how many trained crews. The sums were ugly. The American pilots, in their own compressed narrative, had the benefit of a fortunate conjunction: altitude, sun, the dispersal of the Japanese fighters in the moment, and the exactness of a few ordnance crews caught mid-task. They did not need to do more than place a bomb in the right space at the right second. History, in contest with contingency, sometimes gives the advantage to the actor who arrives at a slightly better angle. As the first 3 carriers burned, the pace of command accelerated into a rhythm of triage. Ships were scuttled or abandoned. Men leapt into the sea and clung to floating wreckage. Life jackets and planks became temporary islands. The sea drank the bodies and refused complaint. Rescue efforts were hampered by the necessity of preserving what remained of the fleet. Saving one man might imperil several ships if the wrong decision was made.
The calculus of saving men or saving assets coexisted on the same bridge, and commands that chose one course over another would be judged by generations who did not live under the task's pressures. Across the Japanese command structure, there were immediate reactions of the sort that do not lend themselves to public oratory. Chief of Naval General Staff Admiral Nagano Osami and Navy Minister Shimada Shigetaro received reports that were duly formal and therefore incomplete. The state apparatus, conditioned to present a composed face, began to manufacture a narrative that the public would consume. Public bulletins, prepared under the pressure of censorial discipline, would not mirror the worst truths of the day. A nation accustomed to receiving its account of events in muted, carefully crafted statements would not at first be told the scale of the loss. Back aboard Yamato, Yamamoto watched his finger trace a withdrawal on the map. He did not speak at length. The folded paper he held was a wordless testament. Those around him moved with the same lean, efficient language of naval procedure. Quiet filled the room like an answer that was both resignation and order. Yamamoto's training and temperament were not made for melodrama. He had been a planner of bold gambits. He had also been a man who understood the limits of force when industrial capacity and strategic attrition come into play. For those who had watched the carriers burn, the idea that this engagement might be the turning point was not an immediate proclamation.
The concept of turning point requires a temporal distance that the men on the decks did not have. They experienced only the sequence of responses: fight the fire, abandon ship, try to account for the missing comrades. Yet for the leadership aboard large ships, the arithmetic of replacement and training loomed large. A carrier lost that night could not be replaced overnight. A trained pilot, nurtured through years of practice, could not be reproduced on a line of production. The silence that followed the arrival of the paper was not empty. It bore a freight of meaning. The smallest motions carried the weight of decisions that would dictate where future battles could be fought and who would bear the cost. Silence in that room was not a retreat from speech, but a speech of its own. Folded paper, a traced finger, a nod of assent to withdrawal. Those were the words that would reshape the next chapters of naval strategy. But the ship of strategy is not only steel and chart tables, it is also memory. Officers would later reflect on the symmetry between the morning's events and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fuchida, in particular, found himself lodged between those two acts of war, once the maker of devastating surprise, now warned by its opposite. He had seen the other side of the script. That image, of a triumphant past now smoldering into ruin, would become part of the common compendium of the war's ironies.
The first dispatches that trickled into Tokyo were shaped to perform a different function than informing judgment. They were meant to conserve morale. Official communiques emphasized tactical successes, evacuated the scale of losses, and supplied the public with a narrative of continued strength. The machinery of censorship and control went into motion. Convalescent sailors were kept from the press, telegrams were reviewed, and discussion of the fleet's losses was quarantined within trusted circles. This public face and the private calculation of command started to diverge, in a way that the men who received the folded paper understood immediately. Within hours of the first hits, the language of the admirals became spare. Chief among their utterances, in public or in private, were not speeches, but small, vivid acts. A folded report placed in a palm, a two-word order issued to save some asset, the silent tracing of a preventative withdrawal. The unbelievable words, if they were to be named at all, were often the brief, decisive gestures that replaced oracular pronouncements. Yet there were also words, rare and cutting, that survived beyond silence. Some were recorded later, some inscribed in diaries, some whispered into the ears of confidants. They would echo back through the ears like fragments of confession. Among them, the most famous and heavily cited, said in a different context but often invoked in the moral arithmetic of the Pacific War, would be Yamamoto's later sentence about having awakened a sleeping giant. It became a hinge in the story told about the war's moral imagining, that a blow meant to preserve advantage could awaken an adversary with the industrial capacity to sustain war for years. But in that lamplit room on June 4, the immediate vocabulary of the fleet was simpler and more physical: paper, map, finger, withdrawal. At sea, the aftermath of the first blows was a working death, not a single storybook drama. Men tried to put out fires, to lift boats, to count the living. Injuries were catalogued: burns, smoke inhalation, broken limbs. The dead were retrieved where possible. Sometimes they were left where they fell if the task of retrieval endangered more lives. Rescue vessels moved with the same cruel geometry as the offensive: save some, leave others. The fleet's remaining carriers, those which had escaped the worst, were suddenly given a different order of priority, to preserve what remained rather than to press the kind of advantage that had been the original aim. The carriers that burned that day would not be the last heavy losses in the Pacific, but their sudden disappearance from the battle order made every subsequent engagement different. Losses concentrated the burden of expectation on those who remained. Ships that in another world might have played supporting roles now had to perform as mainframes for a campaign that had been planned with a different complement in mind.
Among the wounded and the rescued, quiet conversations began that would later be captured in diaries and memos. A young pilot, pulled from the sea and placed on a tender, murmured to an older sailor that in those moments he felt the war had already been lost. Such phrases, uttered in the tight world of a life-saving raft or a field hospital, were not proclamations of strategy, but expressions of a felt truth. The costs they had just witnessed could not be easily reversed. The scale of loss was hard to state in numbers in that first night. Bodies and ships and planes were still being accounted for. What could be said without numbers was the texture of the response: procedures turning into improvisation, command being reshaped by the failure of plans, and a nation's public narrative beginning to separate from the private truth of its leaders. The gap between the two would be filled by censorship, by carefully curated bulletins, and by a quiet drift toward defensive calculus. Back on Yamato, the folded paper had done its work. It had conveyed fact and demanded action without drama. Yamamoto lifted his finger from the chart and looked at the men who waited for his words. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer a long speech. He slid the folded sheet toward the nearest officer, who took it with hands that betrayed nothing but a training that had taught him to treat every order as a uniform fact. That simple exchange sealed a decision that would ripple outward. The fleet would withdraw. The plan to force a decisive battle on Japan's terms had failed in the instant the carriers burned. Silence, in the rooms where commanders met, became a language of its own. The Admiral's unspoken words, the folded papers, the mapped withdrawals, the tight knots, were often more consequential than speeches. They were irreversible acts. They were sentences imposed by circumstance. For those who survived the conflagration, and for those who would read through dispatches later, the image of a folded paper would become emblematic, a small object holding in its crease the weight of choices that no longer allowed for easy reversal. The sun set over a sea littered with oil and wreckage. The remaining ships steamed away from the smoking silhouettes of their lost comrades, each vessel carrying its living, its wounded, and its unvoiced reckonings. In the dark, radios continued to blink message after message into the night. In Tokyo, a bureaucratic machinery spun tentative statements that praised effort and downplayed cost. In the barracks and wards, men counted survivors and counted losses in the only currency they could, the names of friends. And yet the story in its larger contours was not finished. The first night's losses had made the immediate strategic calculus worse for Japan. They had not, by themselves, ended any larger war.
What they did accomplish was to place limits on future options, to set a tempo of attrition that favored the side which could recreate carriers and pilots at scale. The pause that followed, the folded paper, the withdrawal, the silence, was only the beginning of a longer reckoning. Men who survived that day would carry both memory and injury forward. Some would find ways to rationalize the decisions they had made. Some would record their doubts in diaries that they feared to publish. Others would never speak again of what they knew. Yet all of them were part of a moment when 5 minutes, or perhaps the concurrence of fortunate strikes in a single instant, altered the strategic map in ways that would be seen only over time. As the night settled, the unbelievable words of the admirals were not orations delivered into microphones. They were gestures, folded papers, brief commands, and the quiet of men who had seen the limits of calculation. Those small acts would carry consequences for thousands. The sheet of paper, folded and set down, was not simply a piece of paper. It was a sentence pronounced in the stark voice of consequence. The sun that rose on June 5th found a navy that had been remade overnight by a handful of seconds. The smoking silhouettes of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and eventually Hiryu receded into the horizon as the remaining ships, those that had not been ripped open by fire and bomb, turned their bows toward safety. Bodies, bits of wreckage, charred flight gear, and stunned survivors trailed in the wake like proofs of a verdict. The sea itself kept no counsel. It took and kept what was given. In Tokyo, the machinery of state bent quickly to its accustomed task, shape a message that the population would accept. Official bulletins emphasized valor and the resilience of the fleet. They excised the scale of loss and replaced it with an account that could be read in 5 lines or 5 minutes. Press censorship tightened. Sailors who might testify to the truth were withheld from interviews. Telegrams were intercepted and edited. The public was given sentences fashioned to steady the mood of a capital that still expected triumphs to arrive as they had on paper. Behind closed doors, the tone was different. Admiral Nagano Osami and Navy Minister Shimada Shigetaro received reports not as propaganda but as operational reality. They examined the arithmetic that men on bridges had begun to do. How many carriers remained? How many pilots? How many trained mechanics and ordnance crews? The sums were unforgiving. A carrier lost was not an abstract tally. It was a complex of human capital, pilots, maintenance crews, doctrine, and experience, none of which could be conjured overnight. Yamamoto did not indulge in public rhetoric. In the lamplit cabin where the folded paper had been set, the language he and his peers spoke most often after Midway was action: withdrawal, regroup, conserve.
Those verbs, uttered in soft tones and marked by the motion of hands across charts, contained decisions that would reverberate far beyond the adolescent economy of newsprint. They were decisions that would change the shape of campaigns and the lives of thousands. The immediate strategic consequence was stark. The Imperial Navy's carrier force could not be rebuilt quickly. The United States possessed a larger industrial base and an expanding pilot training apparatus that could, with time and prioritization, produce ships and aviators at a scale Japan could not match. The disparity was not merely one of numbers, but of production rhythm, the ability to replace lost capital faster than it could be attrited. From the vantage point of Tokyo staff rooms, this arithmetic meant a shift from seeking decisive, offensive engagements towards defending what could still be held. At sea, survivors whispered truths they felt but could not yet prove. In makeshift wards, in darkened mess spaces, men said what they had seen in the starkest possible way. This engagement had been more costly than hoped. It had perhaps altered the strategic arc. A young pilot, drying seawater from his hair and staring at a blanket, told the man next to him, "We lost them at Midway." It was confession. It was an assessment born of fatigue and grief. Such phrases circulated in private, and in time hardened into the narratives that commanders could not entirely silence. The censorship did not erase memory. Diaries and dispatches that circulated within closed loops contained notes of panic, of disbelief, of measured technical reflection. Vice Admiral Ugaki, a man prone to recorded introspection, wrote in his diary of the funeral quality aboard certain ships, the ritual of counting the dead and liturgies of loss performed at speed. Such private records would later be mined by historians to reconstruct the lived experience of men who had seen the calculus change in minutes. Publicly, however, the government offered a different tenor. Bulletins spoke of gallant resistance, of ships saved, of minor setbacks, and of continuing strength. They emphasized the courage and training of crews while understating the loss of capital that could not be restored at will. The dissonance between public sentences and private reckonings created a double memory, a curated national story, and a seam of truth known in the barracks and the wards. Operationally, the loss of carriers forced an immediate recalibration. The 4 surviving fleet carriers that could still put to sea would now shoulder the weight of operations for which they had not been designed. Support vessels, repair ships, and air groups had to be reallocated. The Navy's possibilities contracted. Its posture hardened into a defensive lines of communication, island strongholds, and the diminished capacity to initiate sweeping carrier strikes.
Where once the Japanese fleet could hope to shape engagements on terms it selected, thereafter it would more often react to American initiatives, constrained by fewer capital ships and fewer trained aircrews. Yamamoto had been a planner whose audacity was matched by an awareness of industrial limits. In private councils after Midway, his assessments grew more pessimistic because they were rooted in the arithmetic of replacement. He recognized not only the loss of iron and welding, but of trained men whose apprenticeship could not be hurried. Some staff-level notes attributed to him a projection of how long the United States would take to mobilize its full industrial advantage. Time spans offered tentatively in conversations, 2 to 3 years. Those figures were not pronouncements for newspapers. They were sober calculations, meant for the judgment of men who had to set policy against a finite horizon. Yet numbers do not tell the whole story. The human cost threaded through every operational decision. The men who had survived the fires and sinkings carried scars, burns, shattered limbs, lungs scorched by smoke, and they bore a mental tally of comrades lost in small personal inventories. Rescue ships gathered survivors and carried them to hospital ships, where doctors, many overwhelmed, battled to save what they could. Conversations in ward corridors and on stretchers became the seedbeds for candid appraisals that could not be spoken in public. The war had changed. Strategic advantage might now lie with those who could outproduce and outtrain. The pattern that followed Midway was both predictable and cruel. Japan, constrained by limited industrial throughput and by attrition in trained personnel, found itself engaged in operations that, while sometimes victorious in tactical terms, eroded its strategic position. A fleet could win battles, yet bleed in ways it could not mend. Islands, convoys, and outposts became grinding grounds for a contest of endurance. Each tactical success could not offset the loss of a carrier and its trained air group. The Navy's doctrine, centered on decisive battle and the leverage of elite strike groups, met the blunt reality of protracted attrition. Within the command community, resignation sometimes sang quietly.
in gestures rather than manifestos. Some admirals, confronted with the arithmetic and the human cost, retreated into silence. Silence itself assumed rhetorical power, a folded dispatch left unopened on a desk, a finger tracing a withdrawal, a brief nod that settled the argument. These acts became the practical language of choices that would determine future theaters and individual fates. Fuchida Mitsuo's trajectory after Midway provides an intimate example of the personal reckonings that sewed through the larger fabric of the war. He had been the voice of triumph at Pearl Harbor, launching waves of attack that had reshaped Pacific confidence.
At Midway, cast into the role of witness and wounded man, he watched symbols invert. He would survive the war and, in the later years of his life, reflect publicly on the moral weight of what he had seen and done. His post-war turn toward religion and reflection, his conversion and his later public remarks, became part of the larger narrative of the human costs of that strategic moment. Fuchida's path was not unique in its complexity, but it was emblematic. Men who had steered great events sometimes found themselves reinterpreting those events in the quiet of later life. Vice Admiral Nagumo's fate, too, followed a course of private torment turning into public tragedy. Once entrusted with the execution of complex carrier operations, he endured the particular brand of shame and blame that follows catastrophic command reversals. The societal and self-directed pressures amassed. In the years after Midway, Nagumo suffered under the weight of what had occurred under his watch. His eventual suicide was a grim coda in the arc that began with decisions about ordnance, timing, and readiness. That ending, somber and solitary, reflected not only personal despair, but the culture of responsibility and honor that governed officers of his generation. Yamamoto's life ended as dramatically as some of the decisions he had engineered, though by the hand of an adversary rather than his own. In April 1943, American forces intercepted his flight and shot it down. His death removed from the Japanese high command a man who had been both strategist and critic of overreaching policy. It also complicated the narrative his colleagues and the public would tell about leadership and culpability. Yamamoto's famous line, "I have awakened a sleeping giant," is often rehearsed as a moral lesson about provoking an industrial power. Delivered in reflection, it stands less as a direct operational sin and more as a confession of strategic insight, a recognition of the long-term consequences of a war extended against an opponent with vast resources. The public narrative, for its part, did not immediately accommodate these complex reckonings. Newspapers and radio spokesmen continued to invoke heroism and sacrifice, while the private calculus of leadership shifted toward conservation. The state's censorship apparatus continued to quarantine inconvenient truths. The ordinary citizenry consumed a curated version of events that left many questions unasked. That gap between public comfort and private dread compounded the poignancy of the Admiral's silence. Where a public expects orations and explanations, the Admirals offered fingers on charts and folded papers. Historians who later sifted the record found more than operational lessons in those folded sheets. They found a moral drama about how states manage truth under stress and about how leaders choose what to declare and what to hide.
Silence became its own rhetoric, and its consequences were measurable. Campaigns altered, lives expended under orders born of conservative calculus, and a national strategy slowly rerouted by the necessity of survival. The casualty figures that finally emerged were terrible in their bluntness. 4 fleet carriers were lost at Midway, along with approximately 3,000 men, sailors, airmen, and support personnel, whose numbers, when added up in lists and rolls, became a ledger of private grief. Those losses were not simply statistical. They were the folding of futures, the truncation of trajectories. Young pilots and seasoned mechanics who would not pass on their skills to succeeding cohorts in the numbers required by sustained war. Beyond the immediate tally, the long-term strategic damage mattered. The United States could rebuild in ways Japan could not. Shipyards, training pipelines, and industrial conversion gave the Americans a tempo advantage. They could produce carriers and aircraft in numbers that, over months and years, eroded the qualitative edge Japan had once possessed. Japan's early war tactical superiority, derived from superior pilot training and concentrated doctrine, gradually gave way to the industrial arithmetic that fueled American strategy. Midway did not by itself end Japan's ability to mount operations, but it began a sequence of attritional losses that favored the side with greater manufacturing and demographic resources. The moral contour of that sequence is not reducible to a single act of decision. It was a concatenation of choices, small and large, some deliberate and some born of contingency. The Admiral's silence, their folded messages, their brief orders, their retirements into chart-room quiet, was in the end an act of speaking. It announced the limits of a strategy premised on decisive, short campaigns when it met an opponent prepared to wage a protracted industrial contest. The silence was an admission that certain kinds of victory require more than courage and craft. They require the capacity to replace loss. When the public finally came to learn more of what had occurred, the official narratives and the private memories did not reconcile into a single truth. There were heroes and mistakes, tactical brilliance and strategic misapprehensions. There was, too, culpability distributed among choices that had seemed reasonable in a world that had not yet fully revealed the extent of American industrial power. That complexity is why the folded paper and the traced finger remain such potent images. They encapsulate the moment when decision-making, constrained by time and imperfect information, produced outcomes of monumental consequence. In the decades since, historians and former participants have debated where responsibility lies, how much was luck and how much was error, and what lessons modern navies should draw.
A recurring theme is humility before contingency, the recognition that plans, however meticulous, must contend with chance and with adversaries whose capacities may outstrip expectation. Military doctrine, which once glorified decisive engagements, had to be reconciled with a modern industrial warfare that rewarded sustained production as much as tactical brilliance. The unbelievable words that the title of this narrative invokes are thus a rhetorical device meant to sharpen attention on what was said and what was left unsaid. In truth, the most consequential utterances of that night were not long speeches or broadcast slogans. They were the folded dispatches that crossed tables without flourish, the fingers that traced withdrawals on maps, the nods that confirmed a retreat, and the private broken phrases whispered in wards and on rescue ships. Those acts, small, precise, irreversible, were the words that reshaped a war. To close where the events themselves stayed, the folded sheet on Yamamoto's table was not merely an administrative object. It was a sentence pronounced in the stern voice of consequence. It told in its crease and stillness that a strategic landscape had altered in ways that would not be repaired quickly. It contained the kind of communication that, because it was spare, carried extraordinary force. If we insist on a final spoken line to frame what followed, we can return to the one sentence often repeated in histories and memoirs to capture the moral arc: "I have awakened a sleeping giant." Those words, spoken later in reflection and invoked ever since, are less a boast than an admission about the long-term effects of choices made in the crucible of war. They stand beside the folded papers and the silences as part of the enduring testimony of Midway, that a few minutes, a few bombs, and a few small gestures can reshape history and leave men to live with the weight of what they could not thereafter undo. The Admiral's words after Midway were not always audible. They were gestures, decisions, and the subtle language of withdrawal. Those were the real proclamations that sentenced ships to disappear and men to die. They were, in their own austere way, unbelievable, because they were small acts that bore consequences too large for words alone, and they remain a lesson about how leadership, silence, and the management of truth can become the most consequential utterances of all. If you want to explore the primary sources and first-hand accounts that informed this account, check the description for links to diaries, official communiques, and recommended reading, and subscribe for more deep dives into pivotal moments of history.